Okay guys, so this is the 3ds Max interface. Now usually when I work in 3ds Max, it's a lot better to just work in one viewport rather than 4 at once. So what I typically do is I select the perspective viewports, and if you hit Alt W, you maximize it. Another way to maximize is having it selected and going to the very bottom icon right here, and this will also maximize. Alright, so to create anything in 3ds Max, first you need to create just a simple box or a cylinder, whichever shape takes form. So right now let's take a box. If we select that box, now we're in box creation mode. So if you left click on your grid and drag, you'll be able to create a box. So right now we're just creating the dimensions of the box. If you hold down Control, you'll be able to create a completely uniform box. So I'll lock into uniform. And if you release, now you specify the height of that box. If you hold down Alt and middle click, you'll be able to rotate. And just holding down middle click or your scroll button, you'll be able to pan. And to zoom in, you could either scroll in and scroll out, or you can hold down Control, Alt, and scroll, and you can zoom in with that. Basically anywhere you click, holding down Control, Alt, and middle click, you'll create a small ball, and you'll be able to zoom in and out of that. If you release Control, you'll be able to rotate. So just try to get used to that. What we'll do is that we'll build a very quick snowman, just so we get used to the controls. So I'll delete that box just by pressing delete. And we'll go here to sphere. And I'll just left click and drag out a sphere. Now to move the sphere around, you need to use the move key, and you can activate that by pressing W. Or if you right click, you'll open up your menu and you can select move, rotate, and scale. So what I always recommend is when you're moving in 3D space, you do want to rotate quite often, because remember, you're looking at a 2D screen that's simulating 3D. So when you want to create another sphere for your snowman, select sphere, left click and drag, and press W to get the move tool. That's the shortcut key. So W, E is for rotate, and R is for scale. So you can easily flip between the three. And the long way of doing it is just right clicking and getting this menu. So remember to hold down Alt and middle click to rotate, and just position your snowman. So just one thing I want to point out is that every time you create a ball, so every time you create a sphere, you're still in sphere creation mode. And the way to quickly exit this is to right click in your background. By right clicking, you'll exit it, and now you have the move tool. If you select a sphere, you can press E to rotate it, or you can press R to scale it. Now just note that when you're scaling, look closely on this little transform here, because if you're right in the middle, you see the right in the middle is highlighted, you're going to scale on all axes. So you're going to get a uniform scale. But if you're scaling with this selected, you're only scaling it on the Z and Y axis, which means that you're going to get, you know, like a coin type of effect. Same thing goes for X and Y. And if you want to scale it only one dimension, then you would just highlight that line, left click and drag. So I'm just going to change the scale of this one as well. If you guys need any help, just put up your hand and I'll pass by. Okay. One thing very easy I actually want to show you guys. So instead of creating spheres and then just repositioning them, there's actually something very cool you can use that will definitely speed up your workflow, and it's called the auto grid. So auto grid basically means that wherever you draw, you're going to be drawing that object on that surface. So if I create a sphere here, I can click on this option called auto grid, and this is actually a super easy way to get your position. So if I wanted to draw his eyes now with sphere, auto grid, left click and drag, you can see that automatically creates a grid based on the other sphere's location. So that way you don't actually have to create on the ground, drag it upwards. Now some common mistakes, guys, is that sometimes people create spheres like out here in space. Now you always want to create it on the ground, because if you create out here in space, it could literally be massive. Like you don't have any control when you create out here in space. So that's why when I recommend when you're creating shapes, just tilt your viewport. Hold down Alt, middle click, rotate a bit, and always create spheres or boxes on the grid. So avoid creating them out in space, because you can see here it's just way out there. And you do want to rotate a lot, because you don't want to build out your spheres like this or your snowman like this. So you don't want to build it in perspective like that, because although it might look like a snowman, the moment you rotate it, you can see it's lying flat. So just make sure you rotate a lot. So I'll just quickly build out a snowman, and then we'll continue with today's lecture. Just put up your hand if you need any help.
Once I put the auto grid on my snowman, it moved it off the grid. Is that fine?
Yeah, it should be fine.
Yeah, that should be fine.
Yeah, that's fine. So remember, if you press E, you can rotate. The only problem with using auto grid, guys, is that because it's a sphere, the auto grid sometimes could be misaligned, or your object could be misaligned, depending on where you drew it. So first hat, I'll just create a cylinder. I'll left click on the ground, drag up. So remember, you always want to rotate, because right now it does look like it's on his head, but if I rotate, you can see it's definitely not on his head, it's just perspective. So best ways to do this is just from the very top view. Now if I ever want to change this shape after I create it, all I need to do is right beside this tab, this plus tab is your create tab. If you go right next to it, the modify tab, you have these settings. And what you can do is that you can go to height, you can left click on these arrows and drag down, and you can control the height of your hat. So I'm just going to create this as a ledge, like that. And now if I go to this hat, if I hold down shift and drag up, I'll make a copy. So that's a quick way of getting copies. Once you release though, you'll get this dialog box. Now this dialog box means, do you want to make it a straight copy? Do you want to make it an instance, so anytime you make a change to this, it'll affect the original? Or do you want to be a reference, which means that it's only going to take reference of the original shape, meaning that you can't really alter it. So if I go to copy, which is what I want, I'm just going to adjust the height now and the radius. So if I left click and drag down, I can adjust the radius like that. So definitely have some practice. Make sure to rotate a lot. So for his arms, I'll just use a box. I'll left click and drag. Once I release, now I'm doing the height. And now I can easily just grab this up, move it in. And remember, if I want to make a copy, I just have to hold down shift and drag. Press OK. Now I can also copy and paste, but I suggest shift and drag is probably a better maneuver, because copy and paste will put your object right above each other, and then you might not notice you have two duplicates. So a couple things that might help you with adjusting the hands is that if you press E to rotate, you can rotate your object here. Now the one thing I want to point out here, guys, is that if I left click, I can rotate, but you can see that it's a floating point number, which means that it's very hard to get a very particular angle, because I have 45.45 or very specific floating point number. So anything that has a .000. So to change that, we can enable snapping. So right up here, this option right here is called your angle snaps. So if you left click to enable that and you rotate this now, you can see it snaps by fives. So this is a quick way to rotate without having a very specific number, like 15 dot something. If I press W, I can move up.
Is there a way to rotate it by typing in the angle you want? Or?
Yes, yes. So if you guys want to manually type in the angle, so make sure you're in rotate mode to this. But if you see when I rotate, if you look at the very bottom, you can see your X, Y, and Z. So if I rotate to my left, it goes into the negatives. If I rotate to my right, it gives me a positive number. So right at the very bottom here. So if I want to do a manual rotation, I can easily type in 90, and you can see it rotates. So if I want to change that direction to my X, so you can see right now, X is this line right here, it's this red line. So if I want to go this way, I just can type in 90. Oh, actually rotate it this way, so it'll have to be the Z. That's weird. Sometimes it doesn't really work though. So this right here, guys, I accidentally created a camera, and we will look at cameras later on when we start rendering shots out. But just FYI, this definitely will happen to you, because if you hit Control C, which is the copy, in 3ds Max, Control C is to actually generate a camera. And Control C will create a camera and put you inside that camera. So if you ever want to exit your camera, just press P and you'll go back into perspective mode. I'm just going to delete these cameras. Okay, so now let's look at our modifiers. So we can get rid of this warm-up session, and we can start looking at to create an actual table. So to create an actual table, we'll need to start with a very basic primitive, something like a box. Now, I suggest when you're creating your table, you want to left-click and drag, and you basically want to decide on how large your table is going to be. What kind of table is it going to be? Is it going to be a dining table? Is it going to be a small miniature table? So decide on the size, and then once you've decided, you can left-click to release, and then drag up. All right, so now with this box, we're going to use a modifier. So if you go right next to the Create tab, so remember this tab right here is all about creating a very basic shape. The very next tab is called our Modify tab. So this is where all the settings of the box are. So if you ever want to readjust anything, you would go inside this menu, left click, hold it down, or you can manually type in the numbers you're looking for. Now FYI, this does support measurements. So if you wanted, for example, 60 centimeters, you can just put cm and press enter, and it'll change it to 60 centimeters. But just note that once it changes, it's going to revert it to generic units, which is 3ds Max's measurement system. If you ever wanted to change this, and we can definitely change it just so we're more in line with real life, because later on when we make realistic renderings, we need to make sure everything is proper size. So to change this, if we wanted to work in centimeters, what we need to do is we need to go here to customize and click on unit setup. Now right now we're using generic units, so this is just a unit system designed in 3ds Max. It doesn't affect the real world. But if you click on metric, you can see we have meters, and we can decide if we want centimeters, millimeters, or kilometers. I'm going to go with centimeters. I'm going to press OK. Now you can see everything has reverted here to centimeters. Alright, so I'm just making this height. Now, a character height is about, let's just reference a character, just because we do want to make sure that this is in real world dimensions. So let's just create another box. If we go to the Create tab here, we can left click on box and drag one out. Now the purpose of this box, guys, is just to give us some character height so we know how tall a character should be. So once I create that, I'm going to go here to the height, and I'm just going to change it to 180. Just so we have a sense of height. Right now 180 is about 6 feet. And then I'll change this width as well to something like 50 by 50. Alright, so this is more of a character height, so you can see that our table is a bit too tall. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select that box, and I'm going to readjust the height here. Alright, it looks better. Okay, so what we're going to do is at first we're going to name our box table. So to name your objects, and it'll be a lot better, especially for your Explorer, because right now we can't tell this apart. But if we select our table, we can go right up here and we can give this thing a name. So let's name this box table. And now we can see it updated in our Scene Explorer. Okay, so to make this into an actual table, the modifier 3D artists use the most, that you'll always pretty much use, and you can pretty much make anything. The only limitation with this modifier is your imagination, because you can pretty much make anything with this. The modifier we want to use, right under modifier list, is called Edit Poly. So you can see that there's tons of modifiers, and we will look at a couple of them. We won't look at all of them, just because there's more than enough. Realistically, the primary one you would always need is Edit Poly. All right.
I can't find the modifier.
Should be on your modifier tabs.
Another way is right-clicking the object. So you can right-click at the bottom. Or no, it's already.
Oh yeah,
It's
I
already a
clicked it.
polygon.
Yeah,
Oh,
but it's
okay,
right there.
okay,
Right?
yeah.
Okay.
That's each
Yeah, I think
list.
that guy dropped our class.
Yeah, of course.
He's like, I don't know what I'm doing. I can't help you.
Basically, when you
Look at me and I'm like, I really don't know. It's too early. Then we
So
expect
when you do this, when you grade it, you always want to make sure that your hand
You know what I mean? Maybe if it
because
was
it's a lot better
you.
than the handles. So make sure you're always rotating. So draw your shape and then hold down Alt and then middle click for scroll button.
Like, I can't believe you're using
No, middle click. Yeah, there we go. So, yeah, so if you hold down Alt and then middle click, right here, this button, select any object and you'll be able to rotate around it. That. That way, you can go up the board. So right now, it might be down here in space. So, yeah, so that's kind of what happens if you create objects like this. You really want to create objects on the top there. Almost like a sense. So you click on box, just left click, just drag out, and then once you release, just drag out to create the dimension of it. Now, once you let go commit to it, you're still in box creation window, so you right click to exit out of that mode. If you hold down Alt and middle click, you'll be able to rotate around the object. It doesn't have to be on that space. That's just giving you like a visual grid for the characters. It could be outside, but basically you want your objects to be clear each other, right? Okay. If anyone needs any help, just put up your hand. It's because that's basically once you put into placement mode. If you want to get the move tool, you can either right click and go to move, or you can press W. If you press W and go to your keyboard, you can move tool. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I noticed that with computers. So guys, if your move, the like gizmo, is really, really small, like if it doesn't look as large as mine on the screen, this is what you need to do. You want to go to Preferences. So if you go to Customize, right up here, Preferences, And then you want to click on this tab right here called Gizmos. And then you want to go right up here to size, and you want to give that a really large size, especially if yours is really small. So if you change this to something a lot larger, and then press OK, you can see your gizmo is a lot bigger. So customize, preferences, gizmos, and just change that to a higher number, and you should be good. All right, any questions before we continue? Okay. So, edit poly. So with edit poly, you can pretty much create any type of shape you're looking for. Basically anything in 3D that you've ever seen pretty much starts out as a box and gets modeled out. Now the way this works, guys, is that you have 5 different modes under edit poly, and you can see them all right here. You have vertex, edge, border, polygon, and element mode. Now to explain briefly what each one does, so you don't have to do what I do right now, just watch as an example. So vertex allows you to select on a corner of a shape and then move that up or down. So vertex is pretty good to select just shapes, pull them out, in and out like that, etc. Edge mode allows you to select on edges and pretty much do the exact same thing. You select on a whole edge and you can move it up or down and change it around. Now FYI guys, it's kind of hard to see my actual edges here. So if you want to enable your edges, you can either press F4, which is the shortcut key to enable edge faces, or you can go right up here to default shading and you can enable edge faces the long way. Well, basically in edge mode, you would select one of these edges and you'll be able to edit them. Now, border mode. Border mode only works if you have an open border, meaning that if you actually have deleted mesh. We'll look at this later on, but basically right now if I do a whole selection, I don't get anything. It's because I need to actually have an open border. To better explain that, imagine if I deleted that face. Now I'll be able to select it with border mode. And I can select the whole border and just alter it and change it. We'll look at that a little bit more later on. Now polygon mode. Polygon mode selects on a whole face of an object. So this is pretty good for modeling out objects. So this selects on a whole face and you can drag and edit it. And element mode, well, element mode selects the whole thing. Now nodes, you might think, okay, what's the difference between element mode and just literally selecting the whole thing and moving it? Well, element mode, what this allows you to do is that you can have one object with multiple elements. For example, when I made a copy of this, I made it into an element. So if I make another element, press OK, and I go back to my Create tab, if I select Table, you can see it selects all 3. So that is what element mode is. Element mode is basically, it's still part of the same mesh, but it's separate. Imagine anything, imagine like a gun, you would have its trigger, etc. That is made in different pieces. So imagine a 3D object that is made in multiple pieces. That would be considered an element. I'm just going to delete that. Okay, so to make this into an actual table, to actually give it legs and all that, what I recommend, and pretty much the most used thing, is pretty much creating a line going across it and extruding it out. So what I want you guys to do is that with this box, I want you to go to polygon mode, and I want you to select the very bottom and then drag it upwards like this. This is going to be the top of our table. So select it and just move it up like that.
How do you want to do on PC? How do you do on PC?
Like command control.
Now,
Not
if we want to create a line,
What?
this is what we need to do. If you click on edge mode, So select edge mode. You want to do a selection box selecting all these edges. So create a selection box with all these edges, and once you release, you should have 4 edges highlighted like this.
Can you do that again?
Yep. So under edge mode, left click on the background and do a selection box. Once you release, you'll have 4 of the edges highlighted. Now the next thing you want to do is you want to use this option right down here under edit edges called connect. Now what connect does is that it'll connect all the lines together with a line. Now the moment you create it, you should have the full line selected, and you can easily move it into a position. Now if you don't have the line selected, if you deselected it by accident, a quick way of selecting the whole loop, because otherwise you would have to manually select all the lines, you could double click it and it should select the whole loop. Now what I want you to do is drag that line to the side of your table. And now we're going to create another line, but this line is going to go horizontal from the table. So this was a vertical line, now we're going to create one that's horizontal. So again, select all the lines. And if we want to use connect, there's actually a shortcut key to this, because we do use this function a lot in modeling. So it's good to get used to the actual shortcut keys. The shortcut key for connect in 3ds Max by default is Control, Shift, and E. So again, that is Control, Shift, and E. Otherwise, the long way is just going here to edit edges and hitting connect. Now we can drag that line to the side here. Alright, so now we're going to create one more line. So I'm going to left click my background so I could deselect my current line. And now I'm going to left click, hold it down, and drag out. And I'll do connect again, so Control, Shift, and E. Control, Shift, E. And just drag this onto the side of your model like that. Now what that created for us is that created individual polygons right at the corners that we can actually use as legs now. Now to actually create legs out of this, we can't be in edge mode. We have to extrude, we have to pull out that face. And to do that, we need to be in polygon mode. So guys, a quick tip, instead of just going to this menu all the time and selecting different modes, you can press 1 to go in vertex, 2 to go in edge, 3 to go to border, 4 to be in polygon, and 5 to be in element. So guys, to do the lines, make sure you're in edit poly, and make sure you're in edge mode right down here under selection. So with that, you want to left click on the background and then do a selection of all the lines like this. And then once you release, you should have all the lines selected from your selection. Now to create a line, you could either go the long way and hit connect under edit edges, or do Control, Shift, and E. That is the hotkey, and you can easily just move it to the side.
Mine is, I don't know if mine's doing your thing. Like, Why is it doing all the lines?
You had multiple lines selected, looks like. So just undo that, and let's see your selection. Oh yeah, so not the whole thing,
No?
just the lines. Yeah, because if you do the whole thing, you'll select all the lines in between. So just undo that.
How do I just
Press 2, and just oh, actually, sorry, accidentally moved that a little bit. Okay. So just left click and drag, but you don't want the whole box. You just want the lines in between.
Click drag in the middle.
In the middle.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Just like that.
Okay.
So it looks like you already still have lines there, so you might have to create a new box or
Okay.
just undo it.
Okay.
Maybe you can just undo it. Undo. There we go. Okay, so try that again. Make sure in edge mode. Yeah. And now do Control Shift and E. There we go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then how do you put the lines and stuff?
Oh, okay. So
Or is that
go up here.
How do you make the lines to make the edges or like for the feet of the table?
Oh yeah, it made like just one line in the middle.
Make sure you're in edge mode. Make sure you don't select the whole box.
Yeah, because I'm used to just going into the settings and having those options pop up.
Yeah. I'm just asking you, Jen.
Yeah, that's what I'm in mind.
It's there, but it's not basically with the box, make sure you're in edge mode. And then when you left click, drag the selection. You don't want to select it. So basically, then it's box. Not totally this side, but yeah, yeah, but make sure when you have this line selected.
Oh, I saw it.
I think you have, so basically if you press space, it'll accidentally lock your object. Resize what? Resize it. Okay. So if you want to make it smaller, good. Smaller. So if you select on element mode, and you press E, sorry, R. And R will be the scale tool, and you can just select on it. Scale it that way. Now, depending on how you want to scale, so right in the middle, we scale uniform, so we'll scale on all edges. If you select this, it'll only scale on X and Y. So it won't get it won't be as small. So if you want it to be bigger, you can click on Z, just pull out like that.
so lazy.
So this happens when you push it on the actual edge table. So if you want the full edge, so right now you're not setting the full edge, do that. Double click on it. You'll click just like now. Oh, I see. The thing is that to make sure when you move it, some stuff you think, you want to make sure you have the whole line selected. You only have part of it, like this. All of it. That's not very well. So just make sure you double click on it. So select it to make it activate. Make sure it's pushed in. Yeah. Select the edges on the pen first. And then it also helps to have edge faces on so you can see the actual lines. Right, yeah, there we go. Sure. It's right in the middle. You press W to get moved. Go away to the middle. Oh, you're moving in the wrong direction. No. Just want to move it on that direction. Drag. Like that. And 4 is to see the actual edge faces there. So if I press F4, you can't see the edges anymore. So make sure you have F4 on. What I suggest is basically it's a lot easier just to hold Alt and rotate like this. Just do this. Just do that. So when you don't have a good angle like this, it'll be hard to do it. So it's better to just rotate like this. And I suggest that unless you're going to use all the viewports, it's better to just hold Alt W to maximize this. You can also maximize the slow option.
Yes, go back. It's becoming like this.
So first you want to make sure you have edge faces on, so press F4. I'll show you the edges. So now make sure you're in edge mode. So if you click on edge mode right there. So what you clicked on here is constraints. You want to make sure there's no constraints. Now, right through here, you can make a selection box. Now make sure that you rotate it so that you're able to do a straight selection. So hold down Alt, there we go. And do a line right through the middle. Like this. So you'll not drag. Now the thing is that it looks like there's space. The space will block the box so you can't do any changes to it. So make sure you don't have this icon. So if you left click and drag, select the edges, and you can do connect. And then you can just move this line like that.
Like, I think your music's on. Turn
Now,
it
the
down.
only thing to point out is that it looks
No,
like
I'm kidding. It was my
it's
phone.
straight here.
It's fine.
What's always playing?
It was just like an ad.
Oh.
That's why I was like, why isn't it jingles?
Normally you want to make sure you're working edge mode.
Now it's one.
It might take a minute, if not, you might have to reopen it. Make sure to just create a box that's straight, because otherwise this one's
Do you listen to Jack White?
okay. You just can't.
Do you know? Do you enough
like,
white stripes?
I never got, yeah, but like, I never got their help.
Yeah.
Sorry. How do you get the lines to make the like the feet of the table? I missed that part too. 'Cause I-
So basically, you want to move this line onto the side. So if you press W, you'll get the move tool. And you can left click, you can drag.
Okay.
to the
And then
side
how
there.
do I add them?
The next line?
Yeah.
So now you want a line going this way. So you
Yeah.
can either rotate the viewport so you can align it so it's easier to select. So you hold down Alt. Yeah. Now make a selection right down the middle.
Yeah. So yeah, my question would be because that shortcut just automatically makes one without having the options to make two and spread them out.
Oh, you mean if you go to settings?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
So if you already have the settings on, then the shortcut would do it. But having the
And then you have to
shortcut
go
just
in to
makes
change
one
it.
line, and then you have to make another one.
Sorry. Can you do that again? Like, what do you mean, like?
Left click
Oh.
and drag. And now you select all of them. Do Control Shift and D to create a line now. There we go. And now you want to move that to the side here. Make sure you move this arrow, because it's the red arrow.
Okay, I see. Okay, thank you.
Like that.
Okay, got
Okay.
it. Thank you.
Okay. I'll just quick cover it up.
Yeah, because you have selected over there.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Oh, so I should like unselect it. But like, why doesn't it show?
Alright guys, so just to quickly cover on how to do the lines. So with a normal box,
Maybe.
Yeah, because control adds instead of
with an edit polygon to it,
just click on don't.
I'm gonna go to edge mode. So under edge mode. Now, FYI, don't do this, because if you select the whole box and do Control Shift E, you'll get connections through the whole box. You only want to select the lines going through the middle. So whatever this box touches, your selection box is going to select it. So whatever edge it touches is going to highlight it and have it active. So I only want the edges right through the middle. So with edge mode, left click and drag, and do Control Shift and D to create a line, and then just move that line onto the side like that. So I'll create another line. So I'll hold it down, drag, Control Shift and D, drag it to the side. And now I always suggest don't do this because we need another line going through the horizontal. Don't do this. You could, but it'll be a lot easier, especially if you have an angle like this. It's a lot harder to actually get all the edges like this. So I suggest to just quickly rotate your object so you can have a clear selection of it, and just left click and drag. So remember to always left click and drag right through the middle of it. Otherwise, if you do this, you're selecting the whole box. So I'll select these lines, Control Shift and E. Now remember, the long way of getting connect is right down here under Edit Edges. So basically what we want, guys, is that we want to have 4 lines going across this, creating smaller polygons on the corners here that we can later just pull out for legs. Is everyone good? Okay. So the next thing we're going to cover is to pull out the legs. Now to pull out the legs, you need to be in polygon mode. So remember, the quick shortcut key for that is just pressing 4. Now with polygon mode, what we can do is that we can select on one of the legs here. Now we also want to select on this leg as well. But you can see every time I select on it, it deselects. Now if you want to do multiple selections, what you need to do is hold down Control. And you should be able to hold down Control and select multiple faces this way. So this is basically what you want. You want to control and select 4 of your corner faces like this. Make sure to align your viewport so it's just easy to see all 4 faces. And now what we want to do is that we want to extrude this out. We actually want to create another box. So what we need to use is this option right here called extrude. Now if you click on it, you activated it. So now it's active. What you have to do next is if you go to a face, you can see that you have this little icon that pops up because you have this face activated. Now if I left click and drag, I'll be able to create a polygon. And if I release, guys, it commits to it, but just note I still have extrude enabled. So to exit this mode, just right click and you exit it. And now you can even manually move this now if you want to manually make any adjustments. So right now my table is a bit too tall. So what I'll do is that I'll change the heights, and the easiest way to change the height, guys, is just to go into vertex mode. So if you go into this mode right here, you can see all the vertices. And like I mentioned, vertices, you get to select one point and you can kind of just warp it. Now this is very situational, but it can be done. But what I like to do in vertex mode is that I can select all these vertices at the very top, and I can drag it down. Now my table is a bit too thick. Now if I want to do small changes, for example, if I want to change the thickness of this, I wouldn't suggest just selecting these edges like this, because the reason for that is because if I select this like this, what could happen is that I might get additional polygons at the back. And remember, you're doing a selection in perspective view, which is kind of hard to get accurate results, because if I do a selection like this, I might accidentally grab some vertices at the back here. So what I suggest is that if you want to change any heights in a very precise way, you want to make sure instead of perspective mode, you change it to orthographic. Now orthographic basically means that you don't have any perspective skewing your perception of 3D. So this basically tells you the exact height and exact dimensions of something without perspective altering it. And this basically allows you to, if you click on this little view cube, click on the front view, you can see that now this is perfectly aligned, and this is a lot easier now. This is almost like a CAD file. It's a lot easier now to do a selection and then drag down.
Sorry, and what was that option? Remove?
For move?
Remove? Okay, thank you.
Just put up your hand if you have any problems and I'll pass by. part's good. You need to create another one here. So go into edge mode. Select all these lines down here. I don't know, don't do this. Otherwise, you won't select it. And so right now it's not selected, and this is actually losing the box because we have this activated. This is basically window crossing. That is not going to select anything that's inside the box. So if we go back to default, which is anything that touches the box, we'll have this edge selected. And now we can connect. Oh, so if you have multiple lines, it's the same. Now we have that. Now you also have snaps on. So snaps is the S key. You might have accidentally enabled that. So it should be looking at all right now. So try to get around right to the middle and adjust that. Control Shift. Make sure you have a line selected. Now look at the very bottom. Hold down Alt, and we'll put this towards the bottom. Press 4 to get into polygon mode. And then just select the corners. Remember to pull down, Control, not this one. Just select that one so you can select that. Like that. Control, and select the next one. And do that for the next one. Now go to extrude. And when you hit extrude, you want to go with the highlighted face. Left click and drag. Drag it over. There we go. Now, if you right click, you'll commit to it. There you go. So now you have set up extrude. And now you can even manually move it if you want to. But right now it looks good. Okay. Alright, everyone's good? Okay. So now what we're going to do is let's create a small little room for our table. But before we do that, let's create some objects on top of our table, like plates, etc. So what we're going to do is that to create a plate, we're going to create just a basic cylinder. So we're going to go back to our primitives. We're going to create a basic shape that later we're going to alter with edit poly. So with this, I'm just going to exit on my selection mode. I'm going to go back onto my create tab. Now I'm just going to actually name this table. Now inside my create tab, so remember this is your modify tab. This is where you change your settings. When you put edit poly, right next to it is your create tab. So this is where you go to create a new object. Now I'm going to create a cylinder for a plate. Now we have auto grid on, so auto grid will basically take fold of any object you have selected. You can see it as my move brush goes onto an object, it kind of changes its direction simply because it's auto gridding. So if I want to create a dish right on top of my table, I just click on cylinder, left click, drag out for how long or how big I want my dish to be, and then drag up. Now obviously we don't want a dish this thick, so we want it probably around that big, and we can edit it later on. Now you don't want these lines going across it, because these lines going across it, they're not as important now, but later on these are basically your details, how much detail is in an object. Basically 3D is communicated in points or vertices. So if I go into modify tab, I can create, or I can actually lower this. Let me remove the segments here. So height segments, I'm going to set it to 1. Just FYI, a quick way to set it to 1. If you right click on the down arrow, you automatically set it to the lowest number it can possibly go, which would be 1. Now we're going to put an added poly onto this. So I'm going to go to my modifier list. Quick way is just pressing ED. So if you press ED, it'll take you to the edit. And now what we can do is we can select on polygon mode and select the very top face like that. Okay, so what we're going to do next is we're going to use another modifier. We're going to use another edit, and this one's going to be called bevel. Now bevel is very, very similar to extrude. The only difference is that there's another threshold to it. You extrude it and then you set on its radius. So to better show you what it does, let me click on it. And if you left click on your shape and drag, you set the height of it. So I might want to give this a negative height like this, because I want our dish to have some depth to it, right? So the food doesn't slip out. So I'm going to push it in a bit like this. And then once I release of my left click, I now have to decide on how large I want it or small I want it. So I do want it fairly small, probably around that big. So now we have a bit of a disc. Now I'm still in bevel mode. So if I right click, I'll exit bevel mode. So I can move my object up and down. So remember, I selected this whole object. I can move it up or down to kind of just play around with the shape. Just put up your hand if you need any help. Okay, so FYI, it might be hard to actually model this because it's on top of a table. Usually the way I like to model things is that I like to isolate it. Now to isolate a selection, if you right click, you'll open up this menu, and it's a pretty big menu, but basically what you mostly need to use is just the move, the rotate, the scale, and right up here is the isolate selection. Now the hotkey for this is just pressing Alt and Q. So if I end my selection, if I press Alt and Q, it will isolate it. But I want you guys to know that there is no way to exit isolation mode. You just have to right click and end it. So there's no shortcut key to end isolation. So if you want to end it, right click, end isolation, or isolate selection. For this I'm going to isolate it and then work on the bottom. So for the bottom, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to select the very bottom. I'm going to click on bevel. I'm going to left click and drag a little bit at the bottom. So I'm going to give it some height like that. And I'm going to drag. So we have like a dish looking object here. Now, right now our dish is way too thick. So if we want to change the thickness of this, the best way to do this is just to select everything like this. Select all the polygons and then press R to scale. And to change it, to actually change this scale here, we only want to change it on the Z axis because we only want to make it thinner. We don't want to change any of the other axes. So just change it on the Z axis. Make sure you only have this wire selected. And you can push it in like that. So right now my plate is looking fairly thin. If I want to make it a bit thicker, what I could do is I can select on this face, press W to get the move tool. So select on this face, hold down Control, and select on the very bottom face. So having both these faces selected, I can move this downwards like that to create what looks like more of a plate. Alright, so now that we have our plate, we can right click and just end isolate. Alright, so the next thing I want to make is a cup. So I'm going to end isolate. Now you can see my plate is somewhat inside my table, so I'm just going to grab it and pull it up. So now a cup, I'm going to make sure to use a cylinder for that. We're going to left click and drag to decide on how big our cup is going to be. We're going to drag upwards. And now we're going to use the edit poly modifier. So I go to modify. I'm going to press ED to take me to edit. And I can click on edit poly. Select on polygon mode. Select on the very top of my cylinder here. And the option I want to use now, guys, I'll give you guys a minute to get here. Alright, so the option we want to use now is called inset. And inset, what it'll do is that it'll create an inset polygon of this polygon right here. So if I click on inset, make sure it's active, left click and drag, you can see it pushes the polygons inwards. So we only want to create a small border like that because the rest is going to be our cup. And now what I need to use is the extrude option here. So extrude, and we're going to extrude inwards like that. Now, one thing I want to point out to you guys is that you don't want to extrude like this, because if you do it all the way, although it might not look like there's a problem, if you look at the bottom, you can see I pushed it all the way through. Now, this is fine because realistically you could exit this mode and just readjust it with your move tool. But just note that pushing it all the way could definitely puncture your table. So basically you want to make sure this is inside the glass. Now you might be wondering, well, it's kind of hard to tell because you can't really see it. What I suggest you do is if you hold down Alt and X, you'll enter something called ghost mode. Alt and X. So it toggles ghost mode, and that allows you to see through an object. And I'll hit Alt X again. Just make sure, guys, if you ever try to move your mesh, don't move it with polygon mode, because this is gonna happen, because I only have one edge or one face selected right now. If you want to move your object, I always suggest when you're moving your object, go into placement mode or to create tab here. And now when you move it, you move the whole object. Okay, so let's create a very basic table knife. Now with the table knife, it might be a little bit more complicated, but we're creating with the box. So we're creating the very foundation of the shape. So I'll use a box, left click and drag. Now I do have auto grid set for this, so make sure you do have auto grid. Otherwise you will have to consistently drag out your boxes on top of your table, etc. So once I create a box, I'm going to go to my modify tab and I'm going to put an edit poly onto it. Now I'm going to select on polygon mode, and I'm just going to change the thickness of this. So before we create this, to get a good reference of how this should look like, we should always use a reference image. So I'm just going to go into the internet right now, and I'm just going to look at table knives. So something like that. Now we're just going to create the basic form of it, so we're not going to go into too much detail. Not yet, at least. We're just going to try to get this basic silhouette shape. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate this because I don't want my table to be in the way, or my plate. So remember, if you hold down Alt and Q with your object selected, you'll enter isolation mode. To exit it, just right click and hit End Isolate. Alright, so the first things first is that we need to make this part up here smooth. So to do that, I recommend using connects. Now there's actually a quick way to do a selection, because right now we could just angle this, do a selection box, select these 4 edges. But another way you can select these 4 edges is that you could just select on one edge like that, and you can click on this option right here called ring, and it'll create a ring going around your whole object like that, and it'll automatically select all the edges going around. So select one edge, select on ring. Now the shortcut key for ring is Alt R. So if you hit Alt and R, you'll get the shortcut key for ring. Now what I want to do is that I want to create a ring here, so I'm going to select this, Alt R, and I'm going to do Control Shift and E to create a line going right down the middle. I'm just going to quickly change this color, by the way, just so you guys can see the line a lot better. So if you want to change the color, just note right beside box, you have your color palette, and you can change the color of your object. I'm just going to set mine to gray. So now with the line going through the middle, what I can do is I can kind of just box out the shape now. And FYI, if this happens to you, if you get lost out in space, just press Z and it'll automatically focus your object you have selected. If you don't have an object selected, so if you don't have anything selected and you're out there in space, it won't work. However, what you could do is that you can select on an object and then press Z and it'll take you right to it. Alright, so to edit this, I'm going to go into polygon mode and I'm going to make sure I'm under vertex. So we want to add some curvature to this. And this is similar to Illustrator's splines. When you're creating lines, you can easily just grab this point. Now, I suggest do a selection box, guys. Always do a selection box. Because if you select on one point and try to move it, well, guess what? You're only moving one point. You're not moving the point right below it. So that's pretty much the problem I see most often, is that people do single selects like that. You don't want to do that, because only selecting it once is only going to select the very top vertex, not the bottom. So that's why I suggest always doing a selection box like that. Anything inside the selection box gets selected, or touching the selection box. And then we can drag this line upwards like that. Kind of just rough up the shape. We're going to do the same thing for the very bottom. You can select this, push it out a bit. Let's look at our shape here. So we have a curve going right through there. So I'm going to create some lines going across now. So if I press 2 to go into edge mode, select these edges, and Control Shift and E to create a line. I can drag that upwards, and I can start roughing out my shape here. So you can see that this line is straight. And then this one's curved. I'm gonna press 2, go into edge mode, do a selection, and then Control Shift and E. Adjust the position of this. Press 1. Select on the vertices and just readjust. And it's just rinse and repeat now. So realistically, I just go back, I press 2, go back to edges, select these edges, Control Shift and E, press 1 to go in vertex mode, and I can easily just grab these vertices, drag them up, and then just reposition them. Now note guys, this is better in the orthographic viewport, because if you are working in perspective, you could get a funky looking or funky selecting option like this. It might be a bit harder to actually work with. So to go into orthographic view, you can just select on this option, click on orthographic. And if you're misaligned like this, just click on the top, on the very top of your view cube here, and just press Z. Remember, Z is like focus, so it'll take you right to your object. Alright, so I'm going to press 2 again, select these edges, Control Shift and E. So I'm kind of going to just spread out these lines. So just know guys, in 3D, each line you put in is pretty much causing more detail. Now you don't have to worry about, you know, breaking this detail, especially with the maneuvers I'm teaching you guys now, because realistically 3ds Max can take on millions and millions of polygons. So polygon is basically a square like this. So right now we're only dealing with probably around 20 squares, not that many. Realistically 3ds Max can handle millions. And later on we'll look at creating really high definition objects that you can even 3D print if you want to. We have a 3D printer here at school. Yep.
We do.
Upstairs.
Upstairs, okay.
Costs 50 grand.
To you?
Not to use, but costs 50 grand to buy.
Yeah.
That's a lot to use.
You get a second to pull, which is returning it
I
all.
mean, I got D&D figures I can print. Freaking Heroes Forge.
So another cool tip I want to show you guys to help achieve this curvature, because realistically we don't want to add single points to create this over and over again, but there's a quick way we can actually do this. So right now we're going to create the very tip of our butter knife, because right now it's just looking like a real knife. So what we want to do is that we want to select on the edge that we want to turn into a smooth edge right here. So if you select on your edge mode, you can select it by pressing 2. Select on this edge. You want to use an option down here called chamfer. Now what chamfer does, if you select it and then left click on that edge and drag, you'll duplicate that edge and cause it to have multiple edges. Now this, you can consistently do this, meaning that you can do it one time, and then if you do it again, you'll create another set of edges. So you can see that you're creating a lot smoother shape now. I'm gonna just readjust that. I suggest when you're making this, guys, just make sure your polygons are evened out. Don't do this, because otherwise it's not smooth. You want to make sure it's evened out like that. Let's do the same thing for the very bottom. Select on chamfer. Select on the edge we want to chamfer. Left click and drag. Give it some space, and then we can even do it again. Okay. So there's a little bit of curvature here. So I'm going to press 1 to go into my vertex. And just start adjusting the sizes here. Like that. Trying to add a small amount of curve. So it's a very subtle curve. So you can see that we took a box, and from that box we created something. So realistically, in 3ds Max, with a box you can create pretty much anything. You can create humans, you can create dragons, it's pretty much endless. Okay, so now what we're going to do is that we're going to end isolation. I'm going to right click, end isolate. If anyone needs any help, just put up your hand. now you see the object for what it is without perspective. So now do selection around one of the points. Drag out that point. So basically that's the idea, is that you want to create a silhouette. So basically you'll create that line, adjust it, and you'll go back into edge mode. So you press 2 and then select a bunch of edges again. You don't have to select the very top, just a little bit of space on those lines. And then control shift. There we go. So now if you press 1, now select those lines. There we go, full count. And you can kind of just work out the shape like that. You got it. So if you press 2 to go to the edge mode. Select the very corner of it. Left click chamfer. Scroll back. Left click right. And 3 through these will commit to it. And if you do it again, it'll go multiply. Okay. No problem. Anyone else need any help? Okay, that's it. Okay. Chamfer. So you want to use the chamfer option. So click on, yeah, you're right, Michelle. Select on the lines. Like that. And then control shift and E. Control shift and E. That is it. So now with the points you can change the position of that, but usually what we do is we go into the vertex, we just grab that vertex and pull it out. So if you don't want to select it, you actually want to leave a selection box to go on it as well. Yeah, because if you move it, you see what's happening. If you move it, it moves like move it, and that's not what the box. So that's why when you select, you should do this selection box. And then you can pull this out like that, and now you move all of them. Okay. So that's basically what you want to do, is that you want to select this, create more of a silhouette, and then you create another one. So you go back into edge mode, press 2, select your edges, and then control shift and E, create another line, position the line, go to vertex, which is your supposed one, select this, and then you go back out. And you basically keep on making basically objects. Okay. And click on chamfer, and with this on a larger screen, right? So if I hit Alt and W, you'll maximize the keyboard. Select that edge. Okay, so let's actually try to attempt a fork. I think a fork might be a bit more difficult, but we'll give it a go. So remember, first thing we always need is just a basic box. So with a basic box, we can pretty much create anything. So we'll just draw the size of that fork. Make it into a box. Now if I hit Alt and Q, I can isolate it. Now one thing that could definitely help us with making out our shape for our fork is that we can actually add segments here. So if we look at this, we can see adding segments actually adds lines for us. So this way you won't actually have to manually do it. So one thing I do want to do is that I want to add in lines right through here. So I'm going to make sure to add 7 segments on the width. So you should have something that looks like this. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put an added poly onto this. And what we're going to do is that we're going to bevel out these shapes. So I'm going to select polygon mode. Now I'm going to select every other polygon. So I'm going to hold down Control, left click, and select them like that. Now the shortcut key to extrude is Control, Shift, and E. Actually, no, it's just Shift and E. So Shift and E is a shortcut key to extrude, and you can left click and drag out your fork shape. Now remember, if you right click, you'll exit your extrude mode, and now you're in edit mode, so you can easily change the shape of this, etc. What I want to do is I want to change the scale of this, because as a fork, you don't have a thick edge at the end. You have very thin edges. So to change the scale, press R. R will give you the move tool. Not the move tool, the scale tool. And then you can scale it on your Z. So if you select Z and drag, you can see we can make it a lot thinner. If we go to move, we can easily just reposition this as well. Alright, so we need to add some curvature here. So if we look at a reference of a fork, so what we're looking here is a very smooth shape. So similar to the knife. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create more lines. So if I press 2 to go into my edge mode, I can left click and drag to select all these lines. and do Control Shift and E. Move my line right up here. And do it again. Control Shift and E. Drag it here. Now you can even change the sizes of this. So if I move my line here, I can press 1. So right now I'm in vertex mode, and I can select all these vertices like that. Press R to now scale it. So now I can scale it on my X just like that. Now this is good, but this needs more curves. So what I recommend doing is press 2, select your edges, left click and drag, select it, and Control Shift and E. And now I can easily just change the size of this. So if I press R, I can create more interesting shapes. Select this, Control Shift and D. Control Shift and E, and just scale it a bit. Alright, so we can attempt to make this more organic, but it is a bit more difficult because we are working with a lot of points here. But basically what I want to do is that make sure I'm in orthographic view, and on my side view here, to my left. Remember, if you're out of space, all you have to do, guys, is press Z, and Z is like focus, will automatically take you to your selected object. And I'm just going to grab these vertices like this, and I'm going to move them down like that. Now I'm going to create another line here, so I'm going to press 2, select these lines, Control Shift and E. I'm just going to reposition this so it's a bit higher, like that. I'm going to change this up here so it's not nearly as thick. So remember, press 1, inside vertex mode, select these vertices, and you can just drag them down. So a cool thing I can show you guys is, it's a bit advanced, but it could definitely help you out a lot. It's called the soft selection. So if you activate vertex mode and then go here to soft selection, you can click on use soft selection. Now what this does is that if I select on a vertice, you can see it creates a small gradient effect, which is really cool. Basically, whatever you have selected is going to be red, and then what's adjacent to it is going to be orange, then yellow, then green, then all the way to blue. Now what this does is that if I select these vertices and move them, it's going to give it a bit of a bevel effect, or a soft move effect. So it's going to be almost like a gradient almost. Now I can adjust this, so I can go up here to fallout, left click and drag to adjust my fallout. So now when I bend this or I move this, I'm only bending the very top. But basically what I want to do is I want to scale this. Because if I scale this, you can see it scales it and it gives a bit of a gradient. So it doesn't all scale it at the exact same value here. Yeah.
Would I do like the full selection to size it down instead of just squeeze it together?
there. So it's like that whole face. So press W. Press W to get the there we go. And I'll just kind of push it into it. Okay. Oh, you scale. So if you press R, you get scale to it, and you want to move it on that axis. So anyone else need any help? Okay, good. So. So what you should do is select these ones instead, because these are the ones we want to pull out. Hold down, control that, and when you extrude, just make sure, because if you extrude upwards, they'll push up that way. If you extrude downwards, it will extrude this way. So just make sure you extrude this way, the opposite way. Push it up like that. Just, okay. Alright, anyone else need help?
They're fun people and like hang out on their thing. She's also cute, but
Need any help before we continue? Yeah, you don't have to worry. So, press 2, make sure you select both these edges, and do Control Shift. And now press 1. You'll have these points. Now these points, select them. Don't just select them because you want to run them. Do selection ones. And basically that's the way it works. You add one detail by adding one box. Kind of create a silhouette of the object. Okay. Okay, so I can end isolate, and now we have a whole set here. Now, typically when working in 3D, just because the human eyes are able to see types of gray a lot better than I can actually see color. So what I usually suggest is that normally when you're working, just select on everything and set it to gray. And the way you do that is just select everything, and under name and color, you can click on this little dialog box and just set it to gray. This way it's just a lot easier for your eye to see what's going on and you're not being distracted with colors. When you're working with more complicated scenes, this definitely helps out a lot. Alright, so now I'm just going to position out my tools. So I'm going to put my plate right here. Now the only thing I noticed is that my fork is slightly longer, well, pretty longer than my actual knife. So I want to change that size. So I'm just going to go to Edit Poly, press 1, and just adjust this. I am going to turn off soft selection for this though, just to make sure it's the same size. Now, if we want to make copies of this going across our whole table, there's a couple ways we can do this. Is one, we can select everything, hold down Shift, and then drag to make a copy. But an easy way would be to group this. Because imagine if we're not going to edit this, imagine we're not going to change this again, we can group all these objects together. So to group, what you need to do is select on one object, hold Control, and select on your next objects. So you can have 4 separate objects all selected at once. Now to group it, you need to go right up here to the Group tab. And the one you want to use is called Group. It's going to ask you if you want to name your group. We can just name it Dining Set. You can see that it creates a group, and inside that group is our individual pieces. But now every time we select this, it's automatically going to select the whole group, and we can move the whole group all at once. So this makes making copies a lot easier and just working with the file better. We don't have to worry about separate pieces all over the place. Now I'm going to select on this shape, hold down Shift, and then drag out. It's going to say if you want to make it a copy or an instance or a reference. Well, realistically, I suggest using an instance, because an instance means anytime we do changes to one, it affects the rest of them. So because if you ever want to change, for example, this fork, it's a lot easier with an instance, because if you change this one fork, it's going to change all the forks inside your level. So I'm going to click on Instance, press OK. I'm going to make another copy. So if I hold down Shift and then drag, creates a copy, gives me the dialog box. I'm okay with having an instance. Now, to move it on this side, we can just hold down Control, select multiple groups, and then drag it onto this side. Instance. Now the only thing here is that you can see it's obviously facing the wrong direction. So quick thing you can do is just rotate this. So if you press E, you could rotate this. Alright, so we'll take a quick break. And after that, I'll show you guys just how to render out a quick scene. It'll just be a preview into what we'll do in the next couple weeks.